Serial killers always seem to capture the attention of the public. There is a morbid curiosity in the monstrous crimes that are committed, specifically in the why and the how. The case of Jack the Ripper is an old one, but it stands as probably one of the most well-known serial murderer cases to have existed. To help you better understand why that is, today we will be going through what was going on in Whitechapel at the time of the murders, the victims and the crimes, and finally, the theories and suspects. So, the location of the crime played a huge role in the MO of this killer. To help you set the scene, you have to understand where the crimes happened. Whitechapel, England in the late 1800s was dark, damp, and dirty. According to southamcollege.com, living conditions were terrible. People were impoverished, and for the most part, they spent their lives attempting to survive. Whitechapel was also home of many workhouses and lodge houses. These were places where people would either send their kids or go themselves to work in exchange for housing. But the conditions in these places were terrible. They were overcrowded, overrun, dirty, and just overall bad. Sex work was also really big around this time. Women had no other option but to resort to this line of work. People were suffering from alcoholism and drug addictions, and crime was at an all-time high. Things were so bad, there were roads police officers would refuse to walk down by themselves, so they had to patrol in groups of 3 to 5 men. It's also important to mention that butcher shops were very, very big and common in this area. So it was completely normal to see people walking down the street covered in blood and guts and different stuff like that. All of these things, pretty much for the lack of a better word, created the perfect setting for the crimes that were about to happen. So now that we have gone through what Whitechapel looked like leading up to the murders, we can talk about the victims and the atrocious acts that were committed against them. It is unknown how many victims there were in total, but the canonical 5 were the 5 women killed between August of 1888 and November of 1888. As I mentioned earlier, sex work was really big around this time. And the reason that that's important to this case is because all of the women targeted were prostitutes. According to casebook.org, the method of operation that this killer had was he would target sex workers, women who were desperate to make some sort of income to be able to rent a room in some lousy lodge house for the night, and lead them into a dark area with the promise of work and money. There, he would wait for a moment where their hands would become occupied, strangle them unconscious, lower their bodies onto the floor, and proceed to slit their throats and remove abdominal organs. So, the way in which he removed their abdominal organs was unexpectedly accurate and with so much precision that many believed he had some sort of medical background. The first of the victims was a woman named Mary Ann Nichols. She was killed on August 31st. Following her was Annie Chapman on September 8th. Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes were killed on the same day. This day was known as the double event. They were killed on September 30th. And the last and final victim that is directly associated to Jack the Ripper is Mary Jane Kelly, who was killed on November 9th. So, the identity of Jack the Ripper remains unknown, but according to History.com, there were 7 main suspects that have been looked into over the years. The first suspect is a German sailor named Karl Feinbaum. Karl Feinbaum was executed in 1894 for killing a woman in New York. The way in which the canonical 5 victims and Karl Feinbaum's victim were found were very similar. It was also discovered later that Feinbaum was a merchant seaman near Whitechapel on every date of the Ripper murders. The second suspect was Prince Albert Victor, son of King Henry VII and Queen Victoria. Prince Albert became a suspect because of an article published by physician Thomas Stowell. The article danced with the idea that Prince Albert had committed the crimes while experiencing fits of insanity caused by a very severe and aggressive case of syphilis. There wasn't much evidence to back this suspect up, so he was dismissed. The third suspect was a man named H.H. Holmes. He was known for killing over 200 people in the late 19th century, and he was thought to have been connected to the Ripper victims. A relative of Holmes stated that Holmes's journals had detailed many and a lot of involvement in the crimes committed overseas. Montague John Druitt was the fourth victim. Was considered the fourth victim after his body was found floating in the river with stones in his pockets. Once his death was ruled a suicide and further investigation was done, it was found that he had been experiencing many personal crises around the same time that the murders were happening. This gave motive. And that, combined with the fact that the murders stopped happening after his death, was enough for him to be placed high on the list of suspects. The fifth suspect was an artist named Walter Sickert. He became so incredibly fascinated with the Ripper murders and the victims and the crimes that his art began to revolve around the crimes entirely. But there wasn't an immediate connection between him and the crimes, so he was also dismissed as a suspect. The seventh suspect was a man named Robert Mann. He was a mortuary attendant and actually examined every single one of the bodies found and every single one of the bodies of the victims. His background and anatomical knowledge fit the profile of the killer. And he was also found to have undressed the body of Mary Ann Nichols when examining her body, which in the eyes of some was to admire his work. The last suspect was actually a woman. Macy Percy was an English woman who was executed in the 1890s because she was found to have killed her husband and his pregnant lover. This connection was found in 2006 by an Australian scientist who gathered the saliva that was found on some of the Ripper letters and created a partial profile which suggested that the killer could have been a woman. Many of the suspects were loose ends, and there wasn't a lot of evidence to go on any of them, so Jack the Ripper's identity, again, is unknown. This was a heavy and loaded topic, and there is still so much to be said. Jack the Ripper is and was and is one of the most infamous serial killers to have existed. Hundreds of years have passed, and his crimes are still talked about, revisited, and investigated. Today we talked about what Whitechapel was like at the time of the murders, the victims and the crimes, and the theories and suspects. I hope this captured your attention as much as it has the rest of the world, and maybe now you can do some research on your own modern-day monsters that you might be more familiar with. Remember to stay safe and be careful, because you never know who you might bump into.